Okay, might as well get started, and they're also wandering when they wander in. What I want to do is try to finish up on the Oahu stuff. There's two things. One, I'm going to go over fairly quickly because it's fairly obvious it's a political issue rather than a design issue. The second one I'm going to spend time on, as I mentioned last time, is this idea of urban core, or Kaka'ako being a good example. So the first one is just this issue of what we call shared use, or more accurately has to do with what we call break bulk. So let's switch out of this to here you see one of the modern container ships. The newest ones that have been built in the last 10 years, now they actually have up to 20,000 what they call TEU, or standardized units. You guys think of these as containers. I think these are all 40 foots, which means they're now, each of these is 2 TEUs. The really big container ships they've built in the last couple of years actually have 20 to 25,000 of these on them. So visualize if they're the 40-foot containers, it'd be what, 10, 12,000 containers on one ship. To put it into context, the ships that come here, the Matson ships come here, bring about 3,000 or 4,000, and they get here about once a week. So this particular ship here with 20,000 basically would be the entire containers for the entire Hawaiian Islands for a month would come on one shipment of these things. This is the huge revolutionary change in the late 20th century, was the move from classic stuff, which was in boxes, or if you go to like Home Depot or something like that, you see things on pallets. That was the way things used to be moved. So you literally had cranes and they put stuff in the boat and they just stack up, sort of like a UPS truck, except a giant version. In the 1960s, a guy literally invented the idea of the container with basically locked boxes. These boxes all lock into each other. So they're linked together. And then you just stick the boxes on a boat and they just ship the whole thing out. The great advantage being that you don't have to actually pick and choose what you're doing. Let's see if we can switch over to another picture here. What you do is you pull off the containers one after the other and then you sort them out. So this revolutionized shipping because all of a sudden now you can just slap stuff in a container. You get it to where you want to go, then you open up the container and take stuff out. And you guys see this, any day this morning, just coming to work, I saw 3 different containers being parked at different places with people unloading stuff off of them. That didn't exist till the 1970s. So this was the huge revolutionary change. In fact, you can see 2 of these monsters right here. Now, one of the other aspects that then comes into play that didn't come into before was if you're a place that makes things. So we'll say that your factory's near Shanghai. You just have a pile of these containers there, and then, when you're making, we'll say TVs, since Christmas is coming, you're just slapping TV after TV after TV in one of these containers, and you seal up, you fill another one, you just fill it up. So you're just filling these containers up, and then what you do is you have someone take them to the port, and they slap them all in the big monster like this. So I'll say this whole back section here is full of literally tens of thousands of TVs. And if you're the TV manufacturer, as far as you're concerned, good, now they're out. If you're someplace like Walmart and you've got a big shipment of TVs coming in for the Black Friday sale or something like that. So say this whole back section of this is all the TVs you need for the entire western half of the United States. Well, the problem you've got into right now is the TVs are all there, but this huge monster ship is going to go into one spot in the United States, probably like Long Beach. They're going to unload all the TVs there. Then they're going to have to figure out which TVs go to which Walmart store in which part west of the Rockies. So all of a sudden these TVs are going to have to travel another 2,000 to 3,000 miles to get to where they're supposed to go. So on one hand, containers are very efficient in moving across oceans, but containers are really inefficient when you think of them actually shipping to a particular destination. Now back in the 70s when this whole started up, a country in Southeast Asia, Singapore, somehow the light went off and they realized that there was a big problem here. And that's figuring out how do you sort the containers. Because they're all at the interface between all the goods coming out of China, Japan, Korea, coming through the Straits of Malacca, the Singapore Straits, and then going off to Europe, Africa, the Middle East, wherever, eastern part of the United States, all coming through that one spot. So what they did is they basically made a big port. This very well be theirs. I don't think this is. It might be Rotterdam, but anyways, a big port like this where they basically just level out a big parking lot. They said, okay, what you guys do is you bring this big container boat here, you park it here for a day or two. we sort out all these containers. So all the containers going to London, we put in one spot. All the containers going to Rotterdam, we put in another spot. All the containers going to New York, we put in another spot. Then you bring another one of these big mothers here. In fact, this might be what this one's doing because it's all sorts of different colors. And what we do is this boat's now going to be everything going to New York. So rather than being sorted out by virtue of what it is, in other words, where it's from, like TVs from Shanghai, now what it is everything that's in the parking lot in Singapore that's designed for New York is going to get slapped on this one boat, and that one boat goes there. Now, what that makes it much more efficient, because you've found a mill place, you've actually geographically picked a spot where ships had to go anyways. Now they're just going to stop there, sort their stuff out, and take the stuff to a particular destination. If you ever get into how UPS and FedEx and even the US Postal move stuff around, that's what they do. They call these break of bulk, and the idea that this would be a bulk. In fact, it might very well be because these are all the same color. These are so you do break of bulk, and break of bulk is where you take this, you sort it out to where it's going to go, i.e. its destination. Then you put it on a particular, in this case, boat, and take everything to the same destination. So you cut down the travel cost, because it was going to have to go that direction anyways. You've just now focused it so it only goes to one spot. And Singapore has become one of the wealthiest nations in the world purely by doing that. Singapore is an island. It's not really that much larger than the island. In fact, it's smaller than the island of Oahu. It's one of the wealthiest nations in the world, and that's because they set up this large lot. And what they do is they sort out everything coming from Asia that's going to go to the whole sort of, that whole chunk of the planet. And of course, to a certain extent, the other ways, is all sorted out in Singapore. It's much more efficient. Everyone loves it. Okay, so that's break of bulk. Now, where we come in is something I mentioned before. Excuse me. If you're looking at the Hawaiian Islands, because we're in the southern part of the northern hemisphere, we're not in the South Seas, we're not in the tropical zone, we're subtropical. But what that means is, since most of your industrial base right now in the 21st century is here, from Vietnam, Southeast Asia, all the way up through Japan, Korea, China, it's almost exactly the same distance within about 600 miles to get to the Hawaiian Islands. Okay. Now, if you're looking at this area all the way from northern Canada, even southern Alaska, through North America, through Mexico, it's almost exactly the same distance within 500 miles to get to Hawaii. We're geographically located right in sort of like the swing spot between these two areas. Now, if you've got a container ship like that big monster and it's taking stuff directly to the West Coast, which is what happens now, then it's going to sit there, it's going to haul all those TVs all over here, probably to Long Beach, California. And then what's going to happen is they're going to take all those TVs out of there, and then they're going to sit there and sort those suckers out. And then they're going to have to drive them up to 1,000 miles in every direction to get them where they're supposed to go. What Singapore pointed out, this is pure geography, it's just literally the physics of distance, is that if you had everyone come here, then you could basically sort all those containers out, just like Singapore does over at this section. You sort all those containers out, and now one boat can go to Vancouver, BC, one boat can go to Seattle, one boat can go to Portland, one boat can go to LA, San Francisco, one boat can go to Acapulco, Western Mexico. It's all roughly the same distance. So now what you've saved all this time of moving stuff up, all the enormous environmental costs in terms of energy, moving this stuff up and down all this area, because you sent it directly to locations that need it, as long as they're in coastal areas. So Singapore back in the 1970s actually proposed to the federal and the state government that, since by then the military was already not using 3/4 of Pearl Harbor, that what Singapore would do is Singapore would provide the money, which Singapore would pay the entire infrastructure cost. And what they would do is they would turn this section and this section here at Pearl Harbor into the copycat of the Singapore container yards. And Singapore figured, despite the fact they were going to spend over $1 billion, that they figured to get the money back in less than 10 years, because they would take a cut of all the movement of goods through this area, which is what they do in Singapore. You pay to have the containers parked there, you pay to have the containers loaded back on. You don't pay a lot. It's still a hell of a lot cheaper than shipping them off the West Coast. But Singapore takes a cut. So Singapore basically told the state, especially, if you can get this okayed, we'll pay all your cost. And the state was interested. The U.S. Navy basically said no. As I pointed out, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, this is the only harbor in the world which is controlled by a military. Not the U.S. government, by the U.S. Navy. The U.S. Navy is only using this section here. It's not using, it has housing and stuff, but it's not using this other area. This used to be ammunition storage. This was all sorts of stuff. So basically, except for storing some old boats, the Navy doesn't use about 75% of Pearl Harbor. And Singapore said, you guys aren't using it. The state of Hawaii could use this. It'd be good for the federal government. And they also pointed out if the military actually, if we went to war with something, you'd now have one of the world's largest container yards for moving goods and military stuff back and forth. So everyone would actually benefit. The Navy just said no. It was sort of like their Kaho'olawe mentality. It was basically, we don't want to share. We don't have to share, and you can't make a share. And they've kept that stance ever since then. I'm not sure why the Ige administration didn't push it with the Trump administration. I think the Trump administration probably would have gone for it since they were very financially driven. It'd be interesting to see if the Biden administration does that too. But Singapore's left the offer open. Singapore is still willing to pay the infrastructure cost. I think what makes this really relevant now is, of course, right now all our money is sunk in tourism, and of course we're absolutely dying on the vine because tourism is a very fragile industry, and as we've seen, it's a very sensitive industry to all sorts of perceptual things, not the least of which is COVID. On the other hand, moving containers around is something you need. People still have to buy stuff. Everything in the world is pretty much still made in Asia. The world's largest set of consumers are Americans. So, despite all the things, that never disappears, at least not in the 21st century. If you were talking about sustainability and you were talking about alternative tourism and stuff like that, then making this area into a massive container yard would be a huge advantage. Another side effect, as Singapore pointed out, you're talking about somewhere between 15 and 30,000 jobs. These are all fairly high tech, very good paying, much better than working as a maid in a Waikiki hotel. The states always thought it's a good idea. They've actually approached the federal government several times. Some branches of the federal government, including Commerce, have actually supported it. But the Navy just adamantly said no, it would sort of over our dead body. And the whole thing just came to a halt there. Hopefully this gets revisited. Break of bulk, it takes advantage of the one thing we have, and that's literally our physical location on planet Earth. Everything else is not substantive. Tourism is not unique to Hawaii. All sorts of places can package the same type of thing. There's nothing else we do here that takes advantage of actually our physical location in the largest ocean on the planet. So break of bulk is one of those things that should have happened. By this time in 2020, you guys should have grown up in a world where that becomes one of your major career options to keep bright people in the state of Hawaii. It's federal politics. But hopefully at some point that might change. One would hope, I haven't seen it come up in the current discussions about alternatives to tourism, but it should be right front and center since someone else is willing to pay the entire investment cost. So we'll see if and when that ever actually goes anywhere. Okay, now segue into the last of these. And that's the idea that I was mentioning this whole thing last week. It's initially talking about the Waiahole Ditch, but also the sort of second city concept. When you look at the idea of second city, that was very much on a mainland model. And that was also sort of based on what I'd call the state legislature, state government model, which has pretty much been keep the large investors, i.e. developers, happy, and keep to the American mantra post-World War II. You have to remember, prior to World War II, large parts of the American population didn't own the homes they live in. In much of Europe, people still own the homes they live in. In much of Asia, people don't own the homes they live in. In America, post-World War II, when you had literally millions of returning veterans coming back, and you had very shortage of jobs, is one of the things the American government decided to do as sort of a post-war veteran resettlement program, was to basically push the idea of single-family ownership. And so what they came up with is it was actually a federal plan to basically build subdivisions for several purposes. One is people, they put into people's mind, to be a real American, you have to own your own home, which was not part of the American ethos prior to the 1950s. What they also put into that is, of course, these have to be constantly built. And of course, this was perfect because if you're looking for a fairly low-tech, low-skill job, the construction industry is perfect. And so massively building these subdivisions across the United States provided literally millions of jobs for American veterans coming back, which meant the government didn't have to figure out how to find them work. So the idea of the subdivision and the mantra of single family ownership of a home, a standalone home, became central to the American sort of economic post-World War II recovery. And once that started going, it was like a snowball going downhill. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And one is because the mainland at the time in the 50s seemed like there was infinite space. It seemed like you could always slap in another subdivision. You could always put something else out there. And yeah, the distance was a little further, but that's what freeways were for, going back to that car thing we mentioned last week. So it was like, it was not a problem. I mean, just build another road, slap in another subdivision, bang, you've got 7,000 new homes. And what that also did is keep large numbers of people in work, provide a huge investment climate, both for the people building the subdivisions, but also for the banks because they're providing the mortgage and the loans for the people that are buying the houses in the subdivisions. So you end up with a huge part of the American sort of economic infrastructure was tied to the idea of single family owned ownership, and also the idea that every 5 years or so, you're gonna go upscale. So a big part of this was not only owning a home, it was the fact that in your life you own multiple homes. As you make more money, you grow into a larger home. Now this was going, this monster basically kept on going from the late 1940s, early 1950s, and finally hit the wall in 2006 to 2008, if you remember the huge recession then, which was entirely just an imploding of this whole idea of single family ownership, because people kept on buying houses, but pretty soon the whole system got so insane as people were buying houses they couldn't afford. People were building houses that people couldn't afford. Banks were giving loans for houses that people couldn't afford. And the whole thing just went, the whole thing fell like a deck of cards, or like a house of cards in 07, 08. Especially if you go to places like Henderson, Nevada, for example, which is still almost 40% unoccupied. So at that point, what should have happened realistically is there should have been like a timeout, and everyone should have gone, well, wait, let's think about this. You know, what was the logic of this? Why is it a good idea? Why is this the only option? Is the way it was presented. But at least on the mainland, that's the way it worked. And you have to remember, by the 1970s, 1980s, most of the banks here in Hawaii were actually mainland owned. So the same pressures that were driving subdivision growth on the mainland quickly hopped over here, and that became the developments of subdivisions in the late 20th century, early 21st century. Was based on this mainland model. The banks wanted in, the developers, of course, wanted in, especially Harita, Castle and Cook, etc. And of course, in a large part, because people had been told since the late 40s that to be a successful American, you have to have your own house. And it was based on the mainland model of a house. This was a ranch style house with a 2-car garage and a backyard and stuff like that, which of course didn't fit Kaimuki, Palolo, Kalihi, and places like that, where those were older plantation style homes from 2 generations earlier. So what happened is it basically said the logic came, you can still hear this the same level in 2020. You have to provide homes for people. And they're calling homes housing. But of course, housing isn't homes. Housing is housing. Homes are single family homes. But by the 1990s in Hawaii, as in the mainland, single family homes became the only viable housing. The only folks that lived in condominiums or apartments were folks that were too poor or too unsuccessful to own a home. So if we want to think about it, there's a contrast between Palolo and the public housing in Palolo, or mayor right housing in Kalihi, and folks living in Aiea, Pearl City. And that became the stereotype, was that only poor people lived in condominiums or apartments. Now in Asia, which in many cases actually more closely reflects this than the mainland United States, because they're a very small island with very restricted land space, what you find is that's never been the case. Single family homes, if you're in the right location, say an agricultural zone, that's fine. But the vast majority of your population lives in apartments, and there's no stigma attached to that. Instead, what you get is you get your pecking order based on where the apartment is. If it's in a really expensive neighborhood, then that apartment's worth millions. In another area, not so much. But you don't have the idea that if you're successful, that means automatically you have a single family home. So they don't have that American mantra, that post-World War II logic the United States cooked up. By the 1990s, it was really clear in Hawaii that there were huge problems with traffic. It was already really obvious that the freeways couldn't catch up. The infrastructure of streets was not sufficient to handle a massive increasing car flow. and that wasn't going to get any better. By then, the Department of Transportation, the state, was already proposal double deckering H1 and H2, with the idea that if you double decker it, you can put you can double the amount of cars on the freeway. It's been pointed out any number of times by almost everyone, my company among others, that if you double deck the freeways, that just means you have twice as many cars now on Waialae Avenue or on Kapahula Boulevard or whatever, which are already loaded up. So you don't achieve anything by double decking the freeways, but that was the only way they could do it. It was pointed out, as even with LA, that basically if you provided room for all the cars on the island of Oahu, the entire surface of Honolulu would be cars and parking lots. There'd be no room for houses. So in that situation, there were basically alternatives. Now, the state's alternative, which was based on this idea of keeping to the American dream of the single-family home, was the second city, and that's what we looked at last time. That's Kapolei and all the subdivisions out from Ewa on out, Mililani, etc. That was option one, if you want to think of it. The city and county, which was violently opposed to that, because the city and county was going to have to provide most of the infrastructure costs. The state came up with the idea, puts the freeway on, which is federal money, and just basically tells the city, here, you deal with the rest of it. The city and county basically said no. The city and county was much more oriented towards the idea that you have to keep ag lands ag. In other words, if keep country, if you want to think of it that way. And so what they said is you have to go the other way. Then the city and county argued that what you have to look at is the Asian model. You have to change people's attitudes to what it was prior to the 1950s. You have to start teaching folks in Hawaii that having an apartment or a condo is not less than having a house. It's just different. And if you want the conveniences of the city and stuff like that, then you're gonna have to live in the city, and that means you're gonna have to go up. You can't go sideways. Now, they also tied this in a rather sophisticated way for the 1990s. They tied that to the fact that if you had people living in the city, then what that meant is they wouldn't be driving as much. So you could cut down the need for, 1.6 cars per driver. So they were basically saying that would also cut down their costs because they would have less road repairs, there'd be less new roads have to be putting in. Your infrastructure cost for a high rise is a hell of a lot less than your infrastructure cost for 100 homes. But when you think about it, if it's a 250 unit high rise, that's the same as this is 150 houses. So, from the city and county standpoint, from the planning standpoint, from basically looking at environmental constraints on a small island into the future. Their argument was that what you have to do is you have to vertically compress the urban area. The urban area of Honolulu has to go up, and that way you can keep Kapolei and Ewa into basically farms and such like that to provide, sustainability to your infrastructure. So if you're going to increase your costs, you do that in the parts of town that are already urban. You don't increasingly urbanize the rest of the island. Now, all this, of course, this discussion was all taking place prior to the change to part-time residents, and especially now in the last 10 years, the growth of Airbnbs and so. But basically, that was the city and county model was number two, this idea of urban compression. They had talked about it, but they really hadn't done too much about it. And then all of a sudden, let's switch out here. In the late 1990s, Victoria Ward, the Victoria Ward trustees, got into a huge row, as was happening with all the trustee families here in Hawaii, almost without exception. That was because what was happening is whether it be Castle and Cook, whether it be the Campbell estate, especially Campbell and Damon estates were really, really vicious, still are actually in the courts right now. Is what you had is by the time you got to the third or fourth generation of grandchildren that had inherited the land of the trust. If you know anything about the word trust in American law, what it means is basically you have a group of, you don't trust the people to manage the things, the actual people that get the land. So what you do is you put it with a set of lawyers or investors, and basically if I'm a trustee for Bishop Estate, if I'm a trustee for a Campbell State trustee, I actually get a check in the mail every month from Campbell Estate. So I don't actually get to make decisions about the land. I just get a cut of the action. And so as a group of people that manage the Campbell Estate lands, and their job is to make sure that all the trustees get as much money as possible from the land that's owned by the Campbell family. That's what being a trustee is. A beneficiary is the other word for it oftentimes. And so in that situation, what happened was right around the 1980s, 1990s, is the folks that were in the families at the time, the trustees, for a lot of these families, sort of across the board decided that they didn't want the money they were getting. They wanted to get a huge sum of change at one point in time rather than getting a check in the mail every month. So they wanted to switch the way it worked. And so what you ended up with is lawsuits between members of the family suing each other to basically break up the trust, with the idea that way, then when they do, they're going to basically liquidate the assets. And at that point, then the family members have a choice. You can either remain with what your part of it's left, in other words, check in the mail every month, or we'll give you X. So basically you get like 200 acres of Campbell estate land that you can then sell in the market. And then when you get that money, that's all you're ever going to get, so you're out. And a lot of the trustees and a lot of different trusts went for, option number 2, selling out and getting a big bang once at a time check. So the trust started to implode and collapse in the 1990s. One of the trusts that was happening to was Victoria Ward, the Ward family, who owned basically everything from Upper Makiki all the way down to the ocean in Kaka'ako, Kavalo. And so they were one of these families that was going at it. They had hired a company to basically turn their lower sections into shopping malls, shopping centers. Remember, Ward's, I think the old one was Ward Center. I can't remember what the original was. And so they were making some money. So everyone was getting a nice check in the mail, but so a lot of the family members decided they wanted a big check and they just wanted to get out of this. And so what they did is they pressured the lawyers and the trust basically to basically liquidate. We want one big bang check of money and enough of this screwing around getting a check every month. And so they actually approached the guys that had done the shopping mall developments, who were GGP, General Growth Properties. And they told them, we want out. And General Growth said, well, what the hell? We'll just pay you a large sum of money, like in a giant briefcase. We'll just pay you, literally, I think it was like $360 million to buy all the property from you. And then you guys can get out and play with your money, play with your 360 mil, and we'll own all the section of what's now the Ward properties. And the family went, yeah, sounds good to us. Boom, they disappeared, and General Growth took over everything that's now, the whole sort of Ward area. Now in that, they also took over Alawana Center, which they just bought. So they owned everything from basically, Waikiki all the way over to basically Ward Avenue. Kamehameha Schools owns all the other property on the other side of Ward Avenue. When General Growth brought this, they had actually just finished a plan with the family to completely redesign Kaka'ako. They took this model that the city and county was talking about and basically said, we think there's a way to make this work. And so what they did is they went through this very, very, very sophisticated, actually really cleverly done logic of trying to convince people that living vertically was as good, if not better, than being stuck in Mililani in traffic for 2.5 hours trying to get into your job downtown. So they specifically targeted it in part for the population that worked downtown, which was smart because that's your federal, your state, your county workers that are making pretty good salaries. A lot of them are unionized. So they've got the money to burn, and many of them were stuck, coming in long commutes. So they're basically saying, do you want to pay $300 a month for a parking spot downtown and basically get stuck for 5 hours a day going to and from work when you could live in a really, really beautiful brand new condominium right in Kaka'ako? You can literally 20-minute walk to work, 20 minutes home. You don't even need a car. There'll be grocery stores and everything right there around you. So they just basically hyped a very European Asian concept of convenience. And also being in the middle of the city, which meant there were more fun things to do and stuff like that versus being stuck out in Mililani, which, well, Mililani is whatever it is. Sorry, I think someone lives in Mililani, no slaps intended. So in that situation, that's what they marketed. They very quickly got state and county approval. The irony is the state wasn't particularly happy about it, but the irony was this whole area, I'll send you the link to the PowerPoint if I haven't already for the Kaka'ako redevelopment. The state actually was the ones that had wanted to redevelop Kaka'ako back in the 1980s. They actually evicted the 300+ families that lived in Kaka'ako. They threw them out of Kaka'ako, closed the schools, closed the churches, and basically blew out Kaka'ako for the purpose of turning into a large extended Waikiki. That absolutely totally failed. It didn't work. And so what happened is the state basically had redeveloped Kaka'ako. It was just empty lots pretty much, with the exception of light industrial still there. So when the city and county and Ward, IAGGP, came in and said, we want to do this, The state really didn't have an argument because it was an entirely legitimate use of property that already spent literally millions and millions of taxpayer money on. So they went, okay. Here's what the original plan looked like. This is the original presentation by GGP. Now, everything you see in yellow, I think it's yellow, is the new development that was proposed. Now, the GGP proposal was fascinating in a bunch of ways. Right off the bat, one of the things they did very cleverly is they actually approached Kamehameha Schools, which is, of course, Bishop Estate, which owns all this section here, and said, do you guys want to go in on this? And Kamehameha Schools was like, yeah, this makes perfect sense to them. And so what happened is when they built the proposal, they did it on several things. One is they were pointing out they were going to basically put 35,000 more people within a 14-block area in this part of town. And of course, the immediate response, and they apparently had figured this out, it was very cleverly done, is that the first thing is people just screaming, how the hell are you going to handle all the car traffic? You're going to have 35,000 more people. That's literally tripling the population down in this entire area in less than 15 years. You're going to have to double up the freeways. All the roads are going to have to be, Ward Avenue is going to be 8 lanes wide. And they said no. They said they're not planning on putting in any parking. The only parking structures in a whole ward development, other than the parking structures in the particular high rises, which are for residents only, are the one that's still at where Target and there is, and there's a small one where Whole Foods is. And that's the only parking structures. They're not putting in any public parking. They said, we're not going to put in public parking. We don't want people taking their cars down here. We're going to intentionally design this so you can't take your car down here. We're going to force people to change their behavior in terms of the use of cars. If you want to live in Kaka'ako, the units in Kaka'ako come with 1 parking stall. If you want to pay for an extra parking stall, I believe the going rate is $120,000 for a parking stall, and then it's yours. So basically, they were telling people you have room for 1 car. You're going to have a very, very nice condo. And we're going to provide, there's going to be easy public transportation. Of course, everything's going to only be within 3 to 5 block walking distance. So your need for 2 automobiles is basically non-existent. And so they're basically telling the state that there was 2 ways you could deal with the problem of too many cars here on Oahu. You can either sit there and keep paving things under, so you have more room for the cars, but that never works because you're just moving the problem down the street. Or you change the behavior about cars. Now you have to remember the Department of Transportation's only solution to all this was to push ride sharing, which, to be honest, when I lived out in Aiea, we did that for a little while. That was a total disaster. It just never works out well. And if you take the bus, again, when I lived out there, if I had to take the bus in, it was to get to Chaminade, it was a 2-hour ride on the bus to get in, a 2-hour ride to get back to my place. And that still included walking almost a mile uphill to get to home. So it just wasn't viable. The state had no clue. The state had no plan. The state had no idea how to fix it. And so what GGP and basically then Kamehameha School said is if you take a spot which is in the urban area and you treat it like Europe or Asia, where you generally don't have cars and people don't have cars and they don't need cars, then you change the whole mentality of the idea that I have to have a car to get around. They're basically saying, no, you don't have to have cars to get around. That's why, especially nowadays, you've got Uber and stuff like that. If you need a car in a particular situation, fine. But why should you pay $300 a month in a parking thing, plus your insurance cost in the car, plus the car itself, all the ancillary cost of a car, just for the added convenience of once in a while when you need it, if you're in the urban core? And so the state bought off on that. The state went, okay, because they really didn't have a counter argument. And that became the ward developments. Now, this is the initial development. As I pointed out, I think last time, Alexander and Baldwin, who was removing their operations from the mainland back to Hawaii, which was a trip, basically at that point got in on the bandwagon, bought a huge proportion of the property basically wrapping around this, and jumped on the same business plan. So this is the business plan for Kaka'ako. It's the diametric opposite of Kapolei. In Kapolei, you need cars. In Kapolei, it's single-family homes. In Kaka'ako, what it is you build your urban high-rises, and that becomes your alternative to the house. You replace convenience, access to the ocean, and everything else by putting people stacked vertically rather than spreading them out, well, like you can see here in the Malca section. That's what you might call the second model. This is what we call the compression model. From an environmental standpoint, it's a lot more responsible and reasonable to the fact that you can't control population. You have to remember, one of the things is back in the 70s, Ariyoshi, who was governor at the time, actually tried to stop migration to Hawaii, or limit it, because he said there were already too many people, the island couldn't handle it, especially Oahu, limited water done, all which is totally true. But under federal law, you cannot tell Americans where to live. If all of a sudden tomorrow, for whatever reason, the entire population of California decided to want to live on Oahu, then there's nothing you can do about it legally. They could just move over here, and you'd suddenly have, I don't know, 80 million people living on the island. There's nothing under American law that allows states or even the federal government to control population migration. It's one of your basic rights in the United States. So the state of Hawaii does not have the right to control population on the island. If they try that, the federal government will step in, the Supreme Court will slap them at the end of it. That's what happened to the Ariyoshi. So this is based on the idea that you basically do two things. One is by virtue of putting the vertical high-rises, you make this unattractive to large parts of the American populace, which have an idea of living on Oahu in a house. In the United States mainland, vertical condos are still not an acceptable alternative to the house for most folks. On the other hand, for the local population, since they're working down here, this makes perfect sense. And the local population, in large part coming from more Asian background, and especially if they're from the older neighborhoods, really don't have the idea of a single family home being this, like palace that they live in. It's a place, it's housing. So if you get a nicer piece of housing, you get to get rid of one car, cut some of your cost, that a brand new place, you've got access to stuff within walking distance, then that's a lot more acceptable to the population here if you market it properly. And that's what they did. That's what they marketed, was basically this is the alternative. Now, here's sort of the dates, the schedule on the whole thing. By 2008, 2009, Kamehameha schools came in. Given their leverage here in the state of Hawaii, they got the proposal approved almost overnight. They immediately became the marketing branch of this. And one of the real interesting things is right from the get-go, is even though GGP originally planned on selling about 70% of the units to investors from Asia and the mainland United States, in other words, just like Waikiki was being sold. When they started to build these things, they very quickly realized the amount of demand here from the local population, i.e. the middle class, was absolutely huge. What they had done right from the get-go is, rather than marketing it as Waikiki, they intentionally marketed it as local residences. This was in part to make sure they didn't get pushback from the state and the city legislatures. But it actually worked out better than they thought. When Kamehameha schools got involved, they actually expanded this. Let's take a look at what this is actually imaged as here. I gotta switch over here. Let's see. So what they did is they very cleverly came up with this concept. And this is the idea of the village. Now, initially, this was a model that actually GGP was using already on the mainland in places like Houston, which is the idea of a vertical compressed village. And they used the term village in the idea of something that was centralized and self-contained. So if you lived in one of these high-rises, you could do all your shopping and everything else around there and not have to deal with, the hassles of, of going places. So it was basically marketing convenience. Now, when they were pushing that here, they decided to put a local spin on it. So they actually called them Hawaiian villages, which was sort of a stretch, to put it mildly. But when Kamehameha schools got involved, and you have to remember that Kamehameha schools in many ways portrays itself as the sort of arbiter of Hawaiian definition of what's Hawaiian. And that's a large part of how they sort of portray themselves. If Kamehameha schools says this is Hawaiian, then So these got some stamp of validation on it versus a mainland development company. So Kamehameha Schools stepped in and said, yes, here's one of the images for Kaka'ako. They argued that basically these were the equivalent to a small Hawaiian village. And of course, Kamehameha Schools was also building these. So they basically put a very neo-ethnic spin on what was high-rise development, with the idea that what you would provide is the people in these buildings would actually be designed so these people in here would get to know each other. These people would do stuff together. And so Kaka'ako would actually become sort of an insular, self-contained entity. The people here would stay here, do stuff together. Their slogan is live, work, play. So you live here, you work in here, and the lower sections, which are offices and stuff, and you play here. You go shopping here, you go swimming here, you do your stuff here. With the idea that as in a traditional ahupua'a, that pretty much everything you did was in the ahupua'a. So basically, Kamehameha Schools put a spin of Hawaiian legitimacy in the whole thing. Back about 4 or 5 years ago, I don't remember exactly when, or their yearly song contest, CAM School does, actually was based on Kaka'ako. The different classes had to come up with a chant, a song that basically extolled what Kaka'ako was and why this was going to work. So I'm actually, talking about marketing to actually drag the school into it. But that was very much a part of what they wanted this place to image as. Oops. And so the way this was presented was very much within the context that this really wasn't something new. They were actually coming up with a new way to reconstruct old values. And so that was the way they presented Kaka'ako, and that's what Kaka'ko's tried to become. We've actually, in my design class, a lot of the years, we've actually done projects related to Kaka'ako. And we're actually in touch with the senior VP at Ward Properties, Howard Hughes. Just as a note, in the 2007-2008 economic collapse, GGP went bankrupt. And so what they did is they'd spun off a subdivision, an entirely separate company called Howard Hughes Properties or Howard Hughes Development. And all this was given to them. So this is now a separate company. General Growth Properties kept Ala Moana Center and the area around that. And the weird thing is, even though they're originally the same entity, GGP came out of receivership, but by then Hughes was separate, and now they actually don't get along, which is really sort of bizarre. Now General Growth Properties and Hughes are actually in competition, which was sort of got a lot of corporate logic. But this is basically Kaka'ako. Now, one of the interesting side effects of this is one of their arguments for Kaka'ako was, let's see if I can find this one picture, is that you could actually change and remodel how you, how you did this. Now, this is supposed to happen next year. This gives you a really fascinating sort of look into, oops, sorry, I screwed that up. Sorry. Having Monday issues. Excuse me. So for example, GGP put in Park Lane, Park Place. I can't remember what that thing is, those condos on the frontage on the Makai side of Ala Moana Center. Those are an example of their competition, if you would, with what Ward was doing, Howard Hughes was doing. One of the side effects of this is Hughes was arguing that if you actually did these developments, you actually should change what streets are. Because their argument was that streets in Honolulu, and it's certainly true if you do a lot of walking like I do, the streets and the streets seen in Honolulu is entirely driven by the car. I walk to and from work down Waialae, and that gets, a lot of those intersections, including 6th Avenue. You got to be really careful because cars don't pay any attention if you're on foot. We're very much a car city. That's why there's so many pedestrian accidents here. Very unlike Europe and Asia. So one of the things that GGP and later Hughes was arguing that you had to change the way that streets functioned. So they actually argued you should take lanes away from cars. So here's the rendering. This is what Ala Moana Boulevard is supposed to look like in 2023, so 2 years from now. Notice how you've actually taken a lane of Ala Moana Boulevard in each direction and it's gone, and now put large landscaped islands in there. You actually expanded this here and taken away another part of a lane to make it more pedestrian friendly and also to put more greenery in. Ward Avenue is in the process. I believe next year they're going to take one of the lanes out in the middle and do basically the same thing. So Ward Avenue is actually going to shrink. So the number of ways to get around by car is going to shrink. They've already taken one of the streets out in Kaka'ako. They're going to take another one of the streets out completely and make that pedestrian only, I believe, by next year. So what they're doing is they're actually reducing the amount of car access. And their argument was, in a rather interesting way, that if you reduced car access, people would have no choice than to start to behave. Their argument was that people will not get out of their cars if they have an option. Or they're just too lazy, and they find the car too convenient, it's got AC or whatever it is, and they won't do it. You have to actually force them out. And so their attitude is if you re-landscape to one, make walking more attractive, friendly, and cooler, and you also make being in a car more of a hassle. And among other things, in Kaka'ako, there's no place to park. So, once tourism comes back and Christmas shopping and regular stores comes back next year, probably next Christmas, Kaka'ako is going to be an absolute nightmare. And that's actually what these guys designed for. They designed it so that it would be very difficult for you guys to use in a car because they figure that's the only way to get you out of your car. The only way you get people to quit using something that's convenient if you make it more inconvenient that it's worth it. It's a very interesting philosophy. It's what they do in Japan and it's what they do in Hong Kong. So it has a history of being successful. And you might be aware back about 8 or 10 years ago, London, for example, which had huge gridlock problems, basically locked the whole city down. There's these really terrifying things now. If you go to London, there's these huge steel pillars that pop out of the ground at, I believe, 6 in the morning. And they lock off the whole center part of the city. If you're inside the city, when 6 happens, or I think it's 6 o'clock, then you have to pay a $300 fine. If you're outside the city, you can't get in. Now they've got ways to drop those down for like emergency vehicles and such, but they completely basically said the whole center of London is now pedestrian, accessible, and cars can't use it for a large part of the day. And that's what more urban centers are doing. Paris is talking about doing this in the next year or so. I think Madrid's already going to do it this year. So what you get is more and more urban areas are realizing that on one hand, when cars were a convenience and there were only a limited number of them, it was fine. But in urban areas, you can't have cars as the dominant factor. It just doesn't work. You have to come up with other ways of doing stuff. And so what you basically see here is a rapid transit, urban transit model with cars very much secondary. I don't know how that's possibly going to work in Ala Moana, given the fact that everyone goes down to Waikiki, but they're basically saying it's going to happen. Now, of course, a lot of this was also predicated on the rail system coming down to Ala Moana Boulevard. So it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But this is the alternate model. So if you think of, if you visualize, one model is the idea of basically spreading people out on the landscape. The other model is basically stacking. Now, it's important to remember that rather cleverly, because you have to remember Kamehameha Schools might be a nonprofit in the sense that the school's a nonprofit. But basically Kamehameha Schools is funded by what used to be Bishop Estate, which is their ground operations. Bishop Estate owns a large part of King Street all the way down past University. If you'll notice, I think they might have paused, but I think it's going to still happen early next year, maybe at the end of this year. At University and King Street, all the stuff across from Puck's Alley is going to go out. I believe Puck's Alley is just scheduled for demolition in 2022. Basically, Kamehameha Schools is using the same model for Kaka'ako, and they're expanding it along their King Street core. So if you guys are, say, sophomores now, by the time 2 years now, if you're coming into campus from King Street, you will see a series of these same type of, 100 plus, feet high, 200 to 300 unit high rises on King Street with the same idea of the village. And this would be scattered all the way down King Street. They already have the design approval to do this in Kapalama and Kalihi. That's supposed to start up early next year. They're basically gutting everything on either side of the canal coming down there, which is all CAM property. And they're going to build another version, basically, of Kaka'ako down there, right next to the HCC campus. So this is the now model for the urban areas. So you have these two competing models. There's the state model, which is dispersing populations across the island. And then you have an entirely running parallel at the same time, and both taking, of course, taxpayer money. You have the city and county model, which is basically increasing the population density in the urban core. The state model has no environmental logic to it. From a sustainability standpoint, it's not an argument at all. The city and county one is, given the fact that you cannot control population, that's not the purview of the state or even the city and county, that, you know, if you have these needs, then their argument is this is your best solution. The city and county one, from an environmental standpoint, at least has, you know, evidence to support it. The state won't back off of theirs because there's too much money invested, you know, and there's whole agencies like Department of Transportation, which basically exist on freeways. So, you know, there's just a huge amount of the infrastructure is attracted to that existing subdivision model. And I don't know that that's going to change. It should change, but I don't think it's going to change right away. It's really interesting if you look at the presentations and the actual current existing ground proposals for both Kamehameha schools, Alexander and Baldwin, and Howard Hughes, in terms of their ideas of what's going to happen. I should point out that the towers that you see that are up now were actually planned to be up in 2 years from now. When they started to build the towers, especially the initial ones from onward, they started to sell out much more quickly than anticipated. And at that point, Hughes and Cam schools shifted their advertising, which was about 60% Asia mainland and 40% here, to about 80% here and only 20% Asia mainland. So even though they originally had planned that only maybe a third of the population living in the high rises would actually be local, the others would be mainland or Asian investors. Now the mainland Asian investors are very much a minority. And according to Race Randall, who's one of the senior VP at Hughes, they're now seeing roughly 80% of the population living in the high rises are actually Hawaii residents that are moving out of houses. He said rather interesting, a large part of the population that's moved into Kaka'ako in the last 2 years has been from Hawaii Kai. And as someone who used to live out that way, you know, that's a nightmare drive in the morning, especially if you got to go all the way to downtown. He said that was a big part of the move into Kaka'ako, was folks selling their homes in Hawaii Kai, and also selling homes, especially in Kapolei and Ewa, Mililani, and moving in because their jobs had never moved. Because if you remember, that whole state issue was the idea that state and private services would move out to Kapolei to make it a true second city, and that's never happened. All they've got out there is shopping malls. So ironically, what's sort of happened is at least right now, the idea that you can have attractive high rises for the local population to move into has been validated. So they've actually upped the plans. Kamehameha Schools now has 3 towers planned, I think 1 tower a year, and basically the downtown side of Ward. Howard Hughes has 2 more under construction now and 2 more planned within the next 3 years. In that entire area, and that includes the area outside of Kaka'ako, which is Alexander and Baldwin's, for example, on the Mauka side of Ala Moana Center. It's now estimated by 2026, in other words, if you want to 5 years from now, there'll be 31 high rises in that area. And will look very much like, if you've ever been to Hong Kong or maybe downtown Tokyo, we're going to look very much like that. And so that's what downtown Honolulu is turning into, is a very sort of Asian look, you know, high-rise dense scenario. So that's sort of the other model. And given the American legal structure, you know, you're gonna have to have some model. So this is one of the reasons why Hawaii is oftentimes used in planning classes as an example of bad planning, because you literally got 2 master plans running simultaneously on the same piece of real estate, which is an island. So that's us. And I'll double check. I'm not sure whether I actually gave you this PowerPoint, but if I haven't, I'll send it out. Okay. So any questions on all that?